So thank you again to Katie for having me here today, and to all of you for coming out to hear a talk about disability and material culture in early America. I really enjoyed looking at the galleries earlier. As I was telling Katie, this is my first time here, and I wish I had come sooner. Today I'm Nicole Belolan, and I'm going to talk a bit about my dissertation, which I just defended this past December. It has a rather long title, Navigating the World, the Material Culture of Physical Mobility Impairment in the Early American North, 1728 to 1861. But in short, it's about the material culture, or the things, that people used in early America to live with and manage physical disability before the era of curb cuts and accessible restrooms, before industrialization and standardization and widespread institutionalization of people with disabilities. As many of you may already be familiar, over the 18th and 19th centuries, Americans came to rely more and more on doctors and medical science, but they continued to manage and live with disability and disease on their own terms. And this often involved objects. So in my project, I wrote about familiar objects of disability like crutches and wheelchairs. I also wrote about more obscure things like gout cranes and adult cradles. And I explored early Americans and their experience with artificial limbs, invalid carriages, clothing. My work does deal with poor Americans on the streets and inside institutions. You won't hear too much about them today, but if you have any questions about some of those aspects of the project, I'm happy to answer those after the talk. Today I'll be focusing mostly on middling and elite Americans who lived fairly comfortably at home with perhaps some servants, slaves, and of course their family. And I think those stories are pretty well represented in the period rooms here, so it should give us lots of food for thought for the galleries here, which is exciting. So again, today I will talk about the fact that in early America, most care for people with disabilities occurred at home. And I will be focusing my talk on the importance of the bedstead and how middling and elite people with disabilities used that object at home in the course of living with acute and chronic illness and disability. Looks like it's in your way. Oh, sorry. Can everyone hear me? And so my goal is to get everyone thinking a little bit differently about the invisible work involved in living with and managing physical disability at home. This is stuff we don't necessarily think about when we visit historic house museums or museum galleries. So one of the primary themes that came up again and again in my research is the concept of improvisation. We see this today. It continues for people with disabilities. There's a really wonderful website that you might be interested in checking out called Engineering at Home, and it's all about a woman who had a leg, or one or both legs amputated a couple years ago. And the website catalogs all of the different material accommodations and improvisations that she has used at home. So for example, she finds it very comfortable to use makeup applicators to serve as a buffer between the stump of her amputated leg and her artificial limb, just to give you one example. But this improvisation has a really long history. Early Americans fell and hurt themselves, and they had to use crutches for a couple weeks. Sometimes people even shared crutches. Sometimes people developed disabling diseases like gout and ended up bedridden for long periods of time. Sometimes they transformed their household chairs into wheelchairs. In all of these cases, Americans used objects and people that they had at hand to manage and live with disability. So to set this up a little bit, I'll talk briefly about gout, which is something that I could go on and on about if you'd like to hear more later. This is a really wonderful illustration of a man in 1825 who is writhing in pain from gout. And someone like him in the 18th or early 19th century might have gone to a doctor. The doctor, or perhaps a lay medical manual, might have suggested some sort of special diet or some sort of salve or blister and you can see that's represented by some of the medical pots to his left. Rich and poor Americans alike had gout. It was is a very painful, disabling type of arthritis caused by a buildup of purines in the joints. And in the absence of a medical cure, in fact, today we still can't cure gout, people turned to objects. They used things like bedsteads. They also made soft, large shoes to accommodate swollen, distended, tender feet. And they also turned to people, ranging from family and friends to slaves and servants, to turn their bodies in beds or to help them go up and down the stairs. So I want to give you more texture about what this involved in the 18th and 19th century. And I will go through a couple case studies that I think illustrates what this improvisation was all about at home when it came to middling and elite Americans. Again, using bedsteads as a focus. So the first case study is going to be about a man named James Logan. He was William Penn's provincial secretary in Pennsylvania. He lived from 1674 to 1751, and he broke his hip right upon his retirement from public life in 1728. Has anyone been to his home Stenton, just north of Philadelphia, by any chance? I'll show you a picture later. It's a wonderful site, highly recommended. The second case study is about Americans who used what are known today as adult cradles to live with and manage acute and chronic disability. Is anyone familiar with adult cradles? Excellent, this will be new for everyone. I would talk specifically about two women who used adult cradles, Martha Aunt Patty Ward, who lived from 1724 to 1794 in Massachusetts, and Mary Moore Brown, who lived from 1776 to 1824 in Virginia. And finally, I will talk a bit about Elizabeth Bradford, a woman who lived from 1809 to 1890. Toward the end of her life, she lived with her two sisters in Duxbury, Massachusetts, and she and her family tried out a variety of objects to manage her impairments in the late 19th century. Before I get to these case studies, I want to outline briefly what I mean when I use the word home for the period of about 1700 to 1840. So the home encompassed people, and it also encompassed physical space and a building. The people included the family, which typically involved a head of household, dependents, who might have included children, a spouse, servants, and slaves. And so this place is where those people lived and carried out their everyday lives. And by everyday life, in this case, I'm referring to activities people do regularly, like cooking, socializing, living with infirmity. So let's begin with James Logan. When I visit the old city in Philadelphia with friends and family, I like to take them here. Does anyone recognize this space at all? That's okay. It's right across from City Tavern, around the corner from the new Museum of the American Revolution, which I saw on your website you have a partnership with, perhaps. You might want to check that out. So it looks just like a blank space, probably used to have a building there. In fact, it did. But if you look toward the back, you'll see a little monument. It's right here. You can barely see it. And this monument is of a place called the Slate Roof House. It was lived in by William Penn. It was built around 1687, and it was demolished shortly after the Civil War. And visiting the site is significant simply because of its association with William Penn and his wife Hannah. But I like to take people here to talk about disability history. Because in January of 1728, James Logan, William Penn's provincial secretary, was probably living here. And so this is probably where he, one morning, walked outside, slipped on a patch of ice, and fell down hard on his hip. He called it his thigh. And this accident changed the rest of his life. Logan was 51. He was in the process of building what he called his retirement home, Stenton, located a few miles north of the city. And when he fell, he and his family and servants first reconfigured this home, his Philadelphia home, and ultimately his retirement home, Stenton. His story is phenomenal. It's a phenomenal resource because he wrote a lot about his disability. He repeated this story over decades to friends, family, and associates. And he wrote that this accident, quote, unhappily disabled him, end quote, and that as a result, he was, quote, obliged to have a bed set up in his parlor, end quote. So Katie was talking about how many parlors are represented in the period room, so that's possibly one way you could interpret disability there. So this is a big deal. As many of you know, the wealthier you were, bedsteads in this period, especially if you had some money, involved a lot of stuff. Elites paid cabinet makers good money to put up and take down bedsteads like this one. But what is a bed? Well, a bed historically referred to the mattress, whereas bedstead referred to the frame. And for those of you who aren't familiar, I'll go briefly through this wonderful didactic at the DAR Museum. The bedstead or frame would have included, from the bottom up, a stacking bottom made like ship sails that attached to the frame with rope that went through grommets, and you can see a little bit of that here. Actually, the shadow does a better job of depicting what we're talking about. Then there's a mattress of straw or other material like feathers or horsehair. And again, this is the ideal. This is not what everybody had. A bed filled with feathers weighing up to 60 pounds. And then, of course, multiple pillows and bolsters stuffed with the same. And finally, bedclothes or sheets. Now again, few people had beds with all the bells and whistles like this, and fewer still had bed hangings, which when closed provided privacy and warmth. So perhaps this type of low-post bedstead that I had shown earlier would have been more common. But once Logan fell, he and his family and servants or hired workers moved a bedstead, probably similar to this one, downstairs to the parlor. Logan spent 16 days flat on his back after he injured himself. If he wanted to sit up, he might have used a lot of pillows. He also might have used a bed chair, which today is often called a husband in places like Bed Bath & Beyond. I don't know that Logan ever had a bed chair, but plenty of his contemporaries in the 18th century did use them. This one is at Winterthur. The upholstery, as you can see, is no longer intact as it would have been historically, but bed chairs like this essentially were the top of an easy chair, and you could move them depending on what angle you wanted to be sitting at. But bed chairs you could buy one. You could also rent them and borrow them. There were ads in newspapers for people to rent bed chairs in the late 18th century. If Logan wanted to move his body, particularly in the days immediately following his injury, he wrote about how his family and servants had to insert cloth underneath him in order to lift him. The doctors he consulted with were not able to fix him, and so he was able to move his hip in and out of its socket, as he put it, almost any way. You can imagine James Logan lying in bed, playing with his joints. So Logan did make it to Germantown, to his retirement home, as he called it, full-time around 1730. But he situated his bedroom, and the curators there think this is a change from his original intention to the first floor. And so if you go there today, that is where his bedroom is interpreted, and it's right here. And when Logan wasn't in bed or at his desk writing, and he wrote a lot, he may have spent time in an easy chair with wheels that was among his possessions upon his death. It's now in a private collection. He also complained often about being, quote, confined to crutches, end quote. And I find this a really compelling phrase because when I first started this research, and maybe you do also, I thought of crutches as a mobility device, something that got you from point A to point B. And certainly they were. But historically, people often thought of having to use them as an indicator that something has slowed you down a bit, so you were confined to them. By the mid-1740s, Logan ventured to Philadelphia, which was only 6 miles away, only a few times each year. He spent a lot of time at home writing letters, which is why we know so much about his experiences. and a series of strokes that he had a couple years after this fall further compounded his infirmities. But if it weren't for these disabilities, Logan would not have produced the most tangible product of his legacy, which is his annotated library. It became the basis of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and in the last years of his life, he made the most progress in annotating the margins of his ever-growing library, which totaled at 2,681 volumes. And historians have recently speculated that these books probably would have been scattered all throughout his house. So you can imagine how often his servants probably had to go on little errands finding this book or that book. So that's Logan's story. We're going to move a little bit forward in time and talk a bit about adult cradles. I think Logan's story outlines one type of improvisation where people reconfigured space. So for example, in this case, he brought a traditional bedstead to the first floor, or when he first got hurt, later reassigned a first floor room as a bedchamber. In this second case study, we're going to talk a bit about a different type of bedstead, known today as an adult cradle. I like to talk about adult cradles a lot. I think they illustrate the point that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, people with disabilities were not shut away from the rest of the family, which is a common misperception about this time period. In fact, for the 18th and 19th century, people with disabilities were a very common, integrated part of everyday life. So first, what is an adult cradle? Well, I have one pictured here. They look like oversized baby cradles. This one does not have a mattress in it or any sort of bedding in it, so you have to imagine that. They were commonly used on the East Coast of the United States from 1780 to 1840 to manage disabilities and chronic illness. And like all furniture, adult cradles varied in construction technique and decoration, but most were designed in the fashion of a wooden child's cradle with two sideboards, a headboard, and a footboard, as you can see like this one. Most included rockers, some lay flat on the floor. They're box-like in their design, and today remind a lot of people of coffins, and because of that can be tricky to interpret. Adult cradles seem odd to a lot of people today, but people use them along the East Coast from Maine to North Carolina. And individuals who needed adult cradles got them from local cabinet makers, or like the oldest known cradle at historic Deerfield, people remade old baby cradles into larger cradles like this one for adult use. And again, people continue to improvise in other ways by borrowing them from friends and family. The people who used adult cradles, of all the people I studied, I think in many cases were the most difficult to learn about. And the way I learned about what it was like to live with disability in early America using these objects was really by studying the objects themselves and not necessarily the letters or diaries left behind by people who used them, because there just isn't a lot of documentation about them. So in the period, people referring to people who used adult cradles tended to use very vague words like invalid, that's a catch-all term for infirmity, words like unhealthy or ill. Sometimes you get some more specific information about illnesses like nursing a toothache or a headache, managing the disabling disease of gout, or the wasting disease of tuberculosis, or managing open sores. In other words, people used adult cradles to deal with chronic and acute discomfort. Adult cradles provided comfort, therapy, and, most importantly, socialization. Now, people who are familiar with adult cradles are mostly familiar with their use in Shaker communities, but again, a lot of other Americans used them also. So cradles provided comfort. We used this cradle as an example. This is Martha Ward's cradle. It's on display in the back left corner of this image at the General Artemis Ward House in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, a historic home owned by Harvard University. Martha, who lived from 1724 to 1794, was known as Aunt Patty, and according to an inscription in an early 20th century family scrapbook, was considered a, quote, semi-invalid all her life, end quote. The specific nature of infirmity is unknown, and family history suggests that Aunt Patty used the Ward House cradle along with a tea table and a rocking chair as sort of a suite of invalid furniture. And Martha's father stipulated in his will that his sons should, quote, provide house rooms suitable for Martha as long as she remained weak and unhealthy, end quote. So this cradle may have provided comfort as Martha aged. Cradles also provided therapy. So again, we have Mary Moore Brown's cradle here at the Rockbridge Historical Society in Lexington, Virginia. They think she used this in the last years of her life in the 1820s. In The Captives of Abbs Valley, which is a historic book you can actually get online for free, I think, through the Internet Archive. It was written by Mary's son in 1854, and it's about his mother's childhood captivity among the Shawnee Indians. And in this book, he noted that his mother had pulmonary consumption or tuberculosis, which may be why she used this cradle. Later, in the early 20th century, a family member, direct descendant, donated this cradle to the local historical society, explaining that, quote, Mrs. Brown suffered from insomnia and that the cradle helped her overcome her sleeplessness effectively. So it's possible Mary used a cradle to rest and perhaps dull the effects of a traumatic experience. So again, these cradles are very difficult to pinpoint precisely how people were using them. Sorry. That's all right. Ooh, do we want to change the color scheme? No. That's never happened before. So cradles provided comfort, they provided therapy, and they also provided socialization. How did I figure this out? Well, I looked really carefully at these objects. So first of all, this cradle has handles. So this is something that's meant to be carried from room to room. You could carry it much more easily than you could by tearing down and putting back up one of those large bedsteads we were looking at earlier. So again, this was, I think, a mobile alternative to allow people to recline or to sit back more comfortably if they didn't want to be inside a bedchamber. Now they could be in the active parts of the household, like in a kitchen or a parlor. I did gain some what I would call firsthand insight into the function of adult cradles. I was studying one from a Shaker community at the Fruitlands Museum in Harvard, Massachusetts, and they happened to have a reproduction of that cradle that they let people try out. They took it off display because nobody wanted to try it out, but of course here comes this very enthusiastic PhD candidate wanting to try out their adult cradle, which I got to do. It did have some bedding in it, a mattress, so I was a little bit higher up in the cradle, and certainly I don't consider myself disabled, but I got a really good sense, I think, of how these cradles really did allow you to remain social with the family. A lot of people assume that you can't see much from lying down in these cradles, but you could really see the whole room. It was very comfortable. Interestingly, I discovered that I could not rock myself unless I tried really hard. So even that requires another person to be there with you to help you rock. So, yes?
Were they also, we have chairs now to help people get up. Mm-hmm. Because it rocked, I would think it would be easier to get up and stand and move because you could get the patient into a position.
That's a great point also, yeah. And I'll talk a little bit more in a couple minutes about all the different things people need to do with people who have a disability or infirm in bed in terms of getting them up for a variety of reasons. But that's a really good point. It would also help with that. Thank you. So cradles, most popular between 1780 and 1840, based on extant examples, they probably declined in popularity because more and more people were being cared for in hospitals or asylums. There was also an increasing interest in making sure infirm or ill people had lots of airflow, and it's possible that they didn't think that a board cradle like this one allowed for that. And finally, there was, in this time period, an increase in interest in rocking chairs, sofas, and multifunction invalid furniture, which we'll talk about right now. So invalid furniture brings us to our last case study involving a woman named Elizabeth Bradford. Toward the end of her life, Elizabeth lived with her sisters, Lucia and Charlotte, in their home in Duxbury, Massachusetts. Again, the precise nature of her infirmities is also unknown, but it's suspected that she was living with the effects of a stroke. As in early America and today, family consulted with doctors, they tried some alternative medicines, and of course, they consulted with each other. At the end of the day, just like our early American friends we talked about earlier, the family ended up improvising with furniture and people power. And this is her house in Duxbury. One of the things the family did is they added wheels to an older easy chair that was also used by Elizabeth's mother and her grandmother. So sort of like adult cradles, a chair on wheels would also allow someone with a disability to be a little bit more mobile throughout the house. Again, you might recall earlier I mentioned that James Logan had an easy chair with wheels when he died in 1751. Like many other individuals we looked at today, when people with disabilities spent time at home, at least some of that time involved using a bedstead. So like Logan's traditional bedstead and the adult cradles, middling and elite people in 18th and 19th century America spent a lot of time and energy thinking of or trying to figure out the easiest way to lift people so they could move them. Because you had to clean bedding, you needed to address wounds, you needed to let people go to the bathroom. Some people, including Elizabeth in 1885, and this is her bedroom as interpreted a couple years ago, in 1885, Elizabeth acquired a specialized bedstead, an Invalid bedstead. And I was giving a talk at this historical society just a couple weeks ago, and they said, oh, guess what? We found Elizabeth's Invalid bedstead in the rafters of one part of our building. So you are the beneficiaries of learning about this Invalid bedstead, because up until this time, we were wondering precisely what this Invalid bedstead looked like. There were many patents issued for Invalid furniture, so it could have looked like just about anything. But now we know. First let me back up. So as I was saying, people for many years have been trying to figure out how to lift bodies and make chamber pots more accessible and that sort of thing. This is one of the earliest depictions of a mechanical bed. It's supposed to be used for, quote, the sick and wounded, published in a book from 1802. It has a crank mechanism in the bottom left, very complicated. And so this is something that, again, is something people continued to work on over the 19th century. So the bedstead that was found in the rafters that Elizabeth used, I can show you some of the patent drawings associated with it. Very simple, right? So here are two screenshots of figure 1 and 2. This bedstead was patented in 1875, and the inventor was from Massachusetts, which is where she's from too. Here's another screenshot. By reading the patent, what I got from it, and again, it's very complicated, and I'm sadly not an engineer, the bedstead allowed you to move the frame horizontally and laterally, quote, like a drawer. And according to the drawings and descriptions, this created two sleeping surfaces. So you could do a lot with that. You could put, the person with the disability could move from one surface to the other, and while that person was on one of the surfaces, you could prepare the bedding on the other one. It was also a way for somebody else to sleep with the person who was using the bed in case that was a concern. A couple years later, Goodwin, who invented this bedstead, issued an improvement that was patented in 1878, and this focused on improving the mechanism for the chamber pot. And this is the bedstead that Elizabeth had. She had the one with this improvement made to it. So by the mid to late 19th century, people were inventing and making invalid furniture that moved up and down and left and right. A traditional bedstead was no longer the only option. So like the thing that James Logan used, the thing that he moved to his parlor. And I think when we see invalid bedsteads like this, we immediately assume, or at least I did, that they must have been better. They must have been better than, the same old traditional bedstead, but it turns out that was not always the case. And it wasn't always the case with other objects associated with disability too, like articulated artificial limbs. At any rate, when it came to this bedstead, Elizabeth and her family actually complained about using these objects. So, for example, the family wrote about trying to find German women who could be found in the city, presumably they're referring to Boston, given their proximity, who would help moving and hoisting Elizabeth, which is something the family was struggling to do on their own. So in addition to buying some sort of invalid bed, the family seems to have installed some sort of hoisting mechanism too, and it's unclear if this was used in conjunction with this invalid bedstead or if they scuttled the invalid bedstead altogether. And the hoist, for many years, the family believed that it might have resembled a bosun's chair, and a bosun's chair would have been used in maritime settings in particular. It would have involved a rectangular piece of fabric that would have had a hole on either side for ropes, and it would have been connected to something that would allow you to move a body up and down. The Duxbury Rural and Historical Society is currently in the final stages of reinterpreting this entire house to focus on women's history, the sisters' history of the 19th century. And it's reopening in July, and I recommend you take a trip up there highly. So they will be interpreting the history of disability there, which is awesome. So we covered a lot of years here, from about 1728 to 1880. But I hope that by taking a look at the material culture of physical disability in middling and elite households through the bedstead, we got some takeaways. First, medical knowledge has always been used, and professionals have always been consulted when it came to living with and managing disability. But an individual's social and economic level dictated their material choices and dictated how people live with disability in home settings over long periods of time. As we can imagine, if James Logan had been a poor American who fell and I assume broke his hip, I don't know for sure, he probably would have died. But he was wealthy and people could take care of him. Second, there were pieces of furniture made specifically for people with disabilities. So people could buy invalid chairs, an early descriptor for a wheelchair, or they could change chairs they had into wheelchairs. But like today, as in the past, people with disabilities used objects and spaces that everyone used. So I think the bedstead and the entire home are really great examples of this. On a related note, I want to make it clear that people with disabilities today and historically, of course, did not necessarily lie around in bed all day, even though I am focusing on bedsteads today. But bedsteads were still an important site of innovation and improvisation. And as all these case studies suggested, people with disabilities used other furniture and accessories inside their homes too, in addition to just bedsteads. So we talked a bit about easy chairs, talked a bit about bed chairs, and of course, adult cradles. So we haven't even gone outside yet, which is something people with disabilities in early America, of course, did, but that is the subject for another talk. My work focuses on physical disability or mobility impairments, but as you could see, particularly with the case of the adult cradles and even James Logan, who fell and then had a bunch of strokes, physical impairment, of course, often overlaps with sensory and intellectual disability too. So it's not as focused of a subject matter as we might imagine. Finally, I think we need more disability history in museums. The historical experience of living with disability involved a lot of work done by the person with the disability, family, friends, servants, and slaves. And disability has and continues to involve a lot of improvisation, making it a great subject to emphasize in museum settings, giving its easy connections to contemporary issues related to aging, healing, dying, and living. And because people do not live in museums usually, it's hard to see this work in house museums or period rooms without some appropriate interpretation. So I'm really pleased that some places that I've featured here, like Stenton and the Bradford House, the Rockbridge Historical Society, and the Artemis Ward House, not to mention many others where I've done some field work, are beginning to integrate these stories of disability into their interpretation. It is a very small but growing field, and I think this is an exciting time for us to think about ways we can include disability in museums, in addition to making museums inclusive and accessible to all sorts of people. So thank you.